Millionaire finds a baby in a dumpster, then sees his own name tattooed on her arm. James Carter, 60, wasn't a food entrepreneur in a glamorous sense of celebrity chefs or trendy restaurant owners. He was, as he often joked, the king of cans. His company, Carter's Organics, had started as a small, family-run cannery in rural Michigan, specializing in locally sourced organic fruits and vegetables. Over the decades, it had grown into a national brand, a staple in supermarkets across the country. He had sold the brand about 8 years ago, but he is still a consultant. James was a practical man, down to earth, and despite his wealth, surprisingly unassuming. He valued hard work, honesty, and community. He lived in a comfortable but not ostentatious home in Grosse Pointe, a suburb of Detroit, a quiet contrast to the bustling city where he had built his business. His life, however, was marked by a profound loneliness. His wife, Mary, had died 10 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving a void that no amount of success could fill. They had never had children, a source of quiet regret for both of them. He had a few close friends, mostly from his early days in the business, but his social life was limited. He spent most of his time working, overseeing his investments, and engaging in philanthropic activities, mostly supporting local food banks and community gardens, a way to stay connected to his roots and give back to the city that had given him so much. On this particular evening, a chilly October night, James had attended a fundraising dinner for a local charity in downtown Detroit. He had grown tired of the small talk and the forced smiles, and had decided to walk back to his hotel a few blocks away, needing some fresh air and a moment of solitude. He chose a less traveled route, a side street that cut through a somewhat neglected part of the city. The street was dark, lined with abandoned buildings and overflowing dumpsters, the air filled with the smell of decay and the distant sounds of traffic. He was halfway down the block, his mind preoccupied with a business deal he was considering, when he heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound, a cry that seemed to come from the depths of the alleyway. He stopped, his senses alert. He listened again. The cry came again, more insistent this time, unmistakably the sound of a baby. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to keep walking, to avoid getting involved, to stay out of trouble. But something, perhaps a flicker of compassion, perhaps a memory of his own longing for a child, perhaps a simple human impulse to help compelled him to investigate. He cautiously entered the alleyway, his footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. The smell of garbage was overpowering, the darkness almost complete. He used the flashlight on his phone to illuminate the scene, his beams sweeping across the overflowing dumpsters, the discarded furniture, the piles of trash. He saw it then, a small, tattered blanket, lying in a heap near one of the dumpsters. And from within the blanket, the cry came again, louder now, more desperate. He rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down and carefully pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny, newborn baby girl, wrapped in a dirty, threadbare cloth. The baby was crying, her face red and contorted, her tiny fists clenched. She was shivering, her skin cold to the touch. She was utterly helpless, completely vulnerable, abandoned in this dark, desolate alleyway. James felt a surge of emotions wash over him. Shock, disbelief, anger, and a profound sense of pity. He carefully picked up the baby, cradling her in his arms, trying to provide some warmth, some comfort, some semblance of human connection. He had no idea who this baby was, where she had come from, or why she had been left in such a heartless manner. But he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her there. He had to help her. He had to save her. The king of cans, the successful businessman, the lonely widower, had just become an unlikely rescuer, his life about to be irrevocably changed by the crying sound of a newborn baby abandoned in a dark Detroit alley. James, holding the baby close, rushed out of the alley and hailed a taxi. He instructed the driver to take them to the nearest hospital, his voice urgent, his hands trembling. He held the baby, wrapped in his expensive overcoat, trying to keep her warm, trying to soothe her cries. At the hospital, the baby was immediately taken to the emergency room, where a team of doctors and nurses began to examine her. James, pacing anxiously in the waiting room, answered the questions of the police officers who had arrived on the scene. He explained how he had found the baby, where he had found her, and the circumstances of the discovery. The police were sympathetic but also thorough, asking detailed questions, taking notes, and treating the situation as a potential crime scene. They informed James that they would launch an investigation, that they would try to find the baby's parents, that they would do everything they could to ensure the child's safety and well-being. After what seemed like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, her expression serious but reassuring. "The baby is stable," she said. "She's dehydrated and malnourished, but she's going to be okay. We estimate she's about 2 days old." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had saved her life. He had given her a chance. He had done something good, something meaningful, in the midst of his own empty existence. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. The doctor nodded. "Of course," she said. "But there's something you should know." She led him to the neonatal unit, where the baby was lying in an incubator hooked up to monitors, her tiny body dwarfed by the medical equipment. She was sleeping peacefully, her cries having subsided, her face serene. The doctor pointed to the baby's arm, her left arm, just above the elbow. "We found this," she said, her voice hesitant. James looked closely. He saw it then. A small, faint, but unmistakable tattoo. It was a name, crudely inked in a simple block-letter font, James C. His name, his initials. He stared at the tattoo, his mind reeling. This was impossible. This was insane. How could this baby, this abandoned child, have his name tattooed on her arm? It was a coincidence. It had to be. A bizarre, inexplicable coincidence. But the coincidence was too specific, too personal, too unsettling to ignore. "We've contacted Child Protective Services," the doctor continued. "They'll be here soon to take custody of the baby. We'll do everything we can to find her parents." But she didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. The chances of finding the parents of a baby abandoned in a dumpster were slim. James felt a surge of protectiveness towards this child, this tiny, vulnerable being who bore his name, this mystery that had suddenly and unexpectedly entered his life. He knew he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her to the care of the state, to the uncertainties of the foster care system. He had to do something. He had to find out the truth. He had to understand the connection, the impossible connection between him and this abandoned child. The mark, the tattoo, had become a symbol, a mystery, a challenge. It was a clue, a faint whisper from the past, a message that he was determined to decipher. He had found a baby in a dumpster, but he had also found a purpose, a reason to care, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that his life, despite its loneliness and its losses, still had meaning. The mystery of the tattoo was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with uncertainty, but also with the potential for profound change, for unexpected connection, and for a love he had thought he would never experience again. James, driven by the unsettling discovery of the tattoo, began to piece together a plan. He knew he needed help, professional help, to unravel the mystery of the abandoned baby and her connection to him. He first called the police, providing them with a more detailed account of his life, his business, and any potential connections to the child. He emphasized the tattoo, the significance of his name, and the urgency of finding the baby's mother. He then contacted his lawyer, explaining the situation and asking for his advice on how to proceed. The lawyer, initially skeptical, agreed to help, recognizing the potential legal and emotional complexities involved. Finally, he hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah. Another coincidence. Chun, known for her discretion, her thoroughness, and her ability to solve even the most challenging cases. He gave her all the information he had: the baby's description, the location where she was found, the tattoo, and the details of his own life. "I need you to find the mother," he told Chun, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. "I need to understand why she would do this, and why she would tattoo my name on her child." Chun, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart, accepted the assignment, intrigued by the unusual circumstances and moved by James's evident distress. While Chun began her investigation, James focused on his memories, searching his past for any clue, any connection, any potential link to the baby's mother. He went through old employee records, reviewing personnel files, trying to recall any interactions, any relationships that might shed light on the situation. His company, Carter's Organics, had employed hundreds of people over the years, from factory workers to executives. He had always tried to be a fair and compassionate employer, but he had also maintained a certain distance, a professional reserve that had prevented him from forming close personal relationships with his employees. He remembered a few instances of offering assistance to employees facing personal hardships, providing loans, arranging for medical care, offering counseling services. He had always believed in giving back, in supporting his workers, in creating a positive work environment. Then, a memory surfaced, a faint recollection of a young woman who had worked in the company's packaging department several years earlier. Her name was also Sarah Miller. He remembered her as being quiet, hardworking, and somewhat troubled. He recalled a conversation they had had, a brief exchange in the company cafeteria. She had been struggling with a personal issue, a family problem, and he had offered her some advice, some words of encouragement. He had also given her the contact information for a local counseling center, a resource his company provided to its employees. He remembered feeling a sense of empathy for her, a recognition of her vulnerability, a desire to help. But he had been busy, preoccupied with his own concerns, and he had quickly forgotten about the encounter. He asked his assistant to pull Sarah Miller's personnel file, hoping to find some additional information, some clue that might connect her to the abandoned baby. The file revealed that Sarah Miller had been employed by Carter's Organics for about 2 years. She had been a reliable worker, but her performance had gradually declined. She had been late to work several times, had missed a few days without explanation, and had eventually been fired for a violation of company policy. The file contained a note, handwritten by her supervisor, stating that Sarah had been suspected of drug use, that she had been offered assistance through the company's employee assistance program, but that she had refused to participate. The shadows of the past employee were beginning to take shape, a picture of a young woman struggling with addiction, a woman who had lost her job, a woman who might have been desperate enough to abandon her child. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the picture they were forming was a disturbing one, a portrait of a life spiraling out of control, a tragedy that had intersected with James's own life in the most unexpected and heartbreaking way. Sarah Miller's life had not always been a struggle. She had grown up in a working-class family in a small town just outside of Detroit. Her father had been a factory worker, her mother a stay-at-home mom. They had been a close-knit family, loving and supportive despite their limited resources. Sarah had been a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of becoming a nurse. She had excelled in school, earned good grades, and had been accepted into a nursing program at a local community college. But her life had taken a tragic turn when her father had been killed in an industrial accident. The loss had devastated the family, both emotionally and financially. Her mother had struggled to cope, sinking into a deep depression and turning to alcohol for solace. Sarah had been forced to drop out of college, to find a job, to support her mother and herself. She had found work at Carter's Organics, a job that offered decent wages and benefits, but it was also a job that was physically demanding and emotionally draining. She had initially been a diligent and reliable worker, earning the respect of her supervisors and her colleagues. But the stress of her family situation, the grief over her father's death, and the constant pressure to make ends meet had begun to take its toll. She had started to feel isolated, overwhelmed, and increasingly hopeless. She had made a few friends at work, but she had been reluctant to share her personal struggles, to reveal the depth of her despair. She had met a man, a charismatic but ultimately unreliable individual, who had offered her a temporary escape from her problems. He had introduced her to drugs, initially as a way to relax, to unwind, to forget about her troubles. But the drugs had quickly become an addiction, a crutch, a destructive force that had taken over her life. She had started to miss work, to make mistakes, to lose focus. She had become increasingly withdrawn, isolating herself from her friends, her family, and her colleagues. Her supervisor had noticed her declining performance, her erratic behavior, and her increasingly disheveled appearance. He had suspected drug use, and he had offered her help, referring her to the company's employee assistance program. But Sarah had been in denial, ashamed of her addiction, and afraid of losing her job. She had refused to participate in the program, insisting that she was fine, that she could handle her problems on her own. She had eventually been fired, losing her job, her income, and her last shred of stability. She had spiraled further into addiction, losing her apartment, her possessions, and her sense of self-worth. She had become pregnant unexpectedly, the result of a brief, casual encounter with a man she barely knew. She had initially considered abortion, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had a flicker of hope, a belief that this child might be her redemption, her chance to start over, her reason to get clean. But the addiction was too strong, the grip of the drugs too powerful. She had continued to use throughout her pregnancy, endangering her own life and the life of her unborn child. After the baby was born, a beautiful, healthy girl she named Hope, Sarah had tried to care for her, but she was overwhelmed, exhausted, and consumed by her addiction. She had reached a point of desperation, a point of no return. She had made the agonizing decision to abandon her child, believing that it was the only way to give her a chance at a better life. She had chosen the alleyway near James Carter's former office, remembering his kindness, his brief moment of compassion, hoping that he might find the baby, that he might somehow help her. She had tattooed his initials on the baby's arm, a desperate, misguided attempt to create a connection, a clue, a message in a bottle cast adrift in the sea of her despair. It was a reckless, irrational act, born of desperation and the distorted logic of addiction. She kept the tattered blanket to remember her child. Sarah's descent had been a tragic spiral of loss, addiction, and despair. It was a story of a life derailed by grief, by poverty, by the insidious power of drugs. It was a story of a woman who had made terrible choices, but who had also been a victim of circumstances, a victim of a system that had failed to provide her with the support and the resources she needed. Her story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of human life, the ease with which a promising future can be shattered, and the enduring need for compassion, understanding, and a helping hand. The private investigator, Sarah Chun, worked diligently, piecing together the fragments of Sarah Miller's life, tracing her movements after she was fired from Carter's Organics, and trying to locate her current whereabouts. It was a challenging task, as Sarah had seemingly vanished, leaving behind a trail of broken connections and unanswered questions. Chun reviewed Sarah's employment records, interviewed former colleagues, and contacted social service agencies, trying to find any information that might lead her to the young woman. She discovered that Sarah had a history of unstable housing, frequent job changes, and several run-ins with the law, mostly minor offenses related to her drug use. She also learned that Sarah had been in and out of rehab programs, but had never managed to stay clean for long. She had a reputation for being difficult, resistant to help, and prone to disappearing for extended periods of time. Chun followed a series of leads, tracking Sarah's movements from one homeless shelter to another, from one low-rent apartment to another, from one city to another. It was a frustrating and often disheartening process, a glimpse into the harsh realities of addiction, poverty, and the struggle for survival on the streets. Meanwhile, James was working with the police, providing them with all the information he had, cooperating fully with their investigation. He was determined to find Sarah, not to punish her, but to understand her, to help her, and to ensure the well-being of his newly discovered daughter, Hope. The police, initially skeptical of James's story, began to take the case more seriously after the DNA test confirmed that Hope was indeed his biological child, or at least carried a very unique genetic marker linked to his family lineage, making her extremely likely to be related. The tattoo, while crude and unconventional, had served its purpose. It had connected Hope to her father, a connection that might otherwise have been lost forever. After several weeks of intensive searching, Chun finally got a break. She received a tip from a social worker in a Detroit homeless shelter who recognized Sarah's description and recalled seeing her a few days earlier. The social worker provided Chun with a possible location, a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Chun, accompanied by a police officer, went to the motel, her heart pounding with anticipation and trepidation. They found Sarah in a small, squalid room, her appearance reflecting the ravages of her addiction. She was thin, pale, and her eyes held a mixture of fear and defiance. The initial confrontation was tense and emotional. Sarah was initially resistant, denying everything, refusing to believe that James Carter, the wealthy and powerful CEO, was the father of her child. She accused him of trying to take Hope away from her, of trying to buy his way into her life. But Chun, with her calm and professional demeanor, managed to de-escalate the situation. She presented Sarah with the evidence, the DNA test results, the tattoo, James's account of their past interaction, and the undeniable resemblance between Hope and the Carter family. Sarah, overwhelmed by the evidence and exhausted from years of running and hiding, finally broke down. She confessed to abandoning Hope, to leaving her in the alleyway, to tattooing her with James's initials, a desperate act of a mother who had believed she was doing what was best for her child. She explained her descent into addiction, her struggles, her desperation, and her unwavering love for her daughter, despite her inability to care for her. She expressed her remorse, her regret, her shame, and her fear of the consequences of her actions. The truth, while painful and complex, was finally revealed. Sarah Miller, the young woman who had once worked for James Carter's company, was the mother of Hope, the baby he had found in the dumpster. The investigation had uncovered a story of addiction, loss, and desperation, but it had also revealed a glimmer of hope, a possibility of redemption, a chance for a new beginning. The confrontation was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would require courage, compassion, and a willingness to confront the past and embrace the uncertain future. The fate of Sarah and the future of Hope now hung in the balance. The meeting between James, Sarah, and the authorities was held at the police station, a sterile and intimidating environment that reflected the gravity of the situation. Sarah, accompanied by a court-appointed lawyer, was facing serious charges: child abandonment, child endangerment, and possibly others, depending on the prosecutor's decision. James, while still reeling from the shock of discovering Sarah's identity and her role in Hope's abandonment, felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, resentment, pity, and a surprising surge of compassion. He recognized that Sarah was a deeply troubled woman, a victim of her own addiction and circumstances, a woman who had made terrible choices, but who had also, in her own misguided way, tried to protect her child. He was determined to ensure Hope's well-being, but he also felt a sense of responsibility towards Sarah, a recognition that she needed help, not just punishment. He knew that his actions, his decisions, would have a profound impact on both of their lives. The meeting was tense and emotional. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying, recounted her story, her voice trembling with a mixture of shame, regret, and a desperate plea for understanding. She explained her descent into addiction, her loss of her job, her inability to care for Hope, and her agonizing decision to leave her in the alleyway, hoping that James would find her. She expressed her deep love for Hope, her unwavering desire to be a part of her life, but she also acknowledged her own failings, her own unfitness to be a mother, at least at that point in her life. The police officers and the social workers listened intently, taking notes, asking questions, and assessing the situation. They were sympathetic to Sarah's plight, but they also had a duty to protect Hope, to ensure her safety and well-being. James, after listening to Sarah's story, spoke, his voice calm and measured, but filled with emotion. He acknowledged his own role in Sarah's downfall, his failure to recognize her struggles, his decision to fire her without offering adequate support. He also expressed his admiration for her courage, her resilience, and her ultimate act of love in leaving Hope where she might be found. He told her that he had already taken steps to adopt Hope, to provide her with a stable and loving home, to give her the life she deserved. But he also made it clear that he didn't want to exclude Sarah from Hope's life completely. He believed that Hope deserved to know her mother, to understand her story, to have a connection to her biological parent, if and when Sarah was ready and able to provide a safe and healthy environment. He proposed a plan, a compromise that would balance the needs of Hope with the realities of Sarah's situation. He suggested that Sarah enter a long-term residential treatment program for her addiction, a program that he would pay for. He also proposed that Sarah have supervised visitation with Hope, gradually increasing the frequency and duration of the visits as she progressed in her recovery. The authorities, while initially hesitant, agreed to consider James's proposal. They recognized his genuine concern for Hope's well-being, his commitment to providing her with a stable and loving home, and his willingness to help Sarah get the treatment she needed. Sarah, overwhelmed by James's unexpected compassion and his willingness to give her a second chance, broke down in tears. She agreed to enter the treatment program, vowing to do everything in her power to overcome her addiction, to become a better person, to earn the right to be a part of Hope's life. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had brought the truth to light, exposed the raw emotions, and paved the way for a possible resolution, a path towards healing, forgiveness, and a future where Hope could have a relationship with both her father and her mother. The consequences of Sarah's actions were significant, but compassion, understanding, and a willingness to offer second chances had tempered the harshness of judgment, creating a space for hope, for redemption, and for the rebuilding of shattered lives. She was going to serve 1 year of community service and probation. The legal process of adopting Hope was complex and emotionally challenging, even with James's resources and influence. Child Protective Services, CPS, conducted a thorough investigation, assessing James's suitability as a parent, evaluating his home environment, and interviewing him extensively about his past, his present, and his plans for the future. James, despite his wealth and his status, was subjected to the same scrutiny as any other prospective adoptive parent. He had to undergo background checks, home visits, psychological evaluations, and parenting classes. He was determined to prove to CPS and to himself that he was capable of providing Hope with a loving, stable, and nurturing home. He transformed his mansion, once a sterile showcase of his wealth, into a warm and welcoming home for a child. He converted one of the guest rooms into a nursery, filled with toys, books, and colorful decorations. He hired a nanny, a kind and experienced woman, to help him care for Hope, but he was also determined to be a hands-on father, to be actively involved in every aspect of his daughter's life. He learned to change diapers, to feed Hope, to soothe her cries, to read her bedtime stories. He discovered the joys and challenges of parenthood, the unconditional love, the overwhelming responsibility, the constant worry, and the profound satisfaction of watching a child grow and thrive. He also continued to support Sarah's recovery, visiting her regularly at the treatment facility, encouraging her progress, and reassuring her that she would have a place in Hope's life when she was ready. He understood that Sarah's recovery was essential, not only for her own well-being, but also for Hope's, for the possibility of building a healthy, albeit unconventional, family dynamic. The adoption journey was not just a legal process. It was an emotional transformation for James. He had been a solitary man, focused on his business, his wealth, and his own grief. Now, he was a father responsible for the well-being of a child, connected to a woman he had once barely known, and embarking on a new chapter in his life, a chapter filled with challenges, but also with a profound sense of purpose and a love he had never imagined he could feel again. He also had to confront his own past, his own mistakes, his own failings. He had to acknowledge the role he had played in Sarah's downfall, the consequences of his actions, and the responsibility he now bore for making amends, not just to Hope, but also to Sarah. After several months of rigorous evaluation, and with Sarah's signed consent for the treatment center, she's allowed by CPS to do it, the adoption was finalized. Hope officially became Hope Carter, James's legal daughter, the heir to his fortune, but more importantly, the recipient of his love, his attention, and his unwavering commitment to providing her with the best possible life. The adoption journey had been a transformative experience for James, a journey from loneliness to connection, from grief to hope, from a life focused on material success to a life centered on the love and responsibility of fatherhood. It was a journey that had challenged him, changed him, and ultimately redeemed him, proving that even the most unexpected and tragic circumstances could lead to new beginnings, new families, and new possibilities for love and happiness. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformative power of love, and the enduring possibility of second chances. Hope grew into a bright, curious, and compassionate young girl. She thrived under James's care, blossoming into a confident and well-adjusted child. She loved her new home, her new life, and her new father, but she also remembered Sarah, her biological mother, with fondness and a growing understanding of her struggles. James, true to his word, facilitated regular visits between Hope and Sarah, carefully supervised and structured at first, but gradually becoming more relaxed and natural as Sarah progressed in her recovery and demonstrated her commitment to sobriety and responsible parenting. Sarah, after completing her treatment program, dedicated herself to rebuilding her life. She found a job as a peer support specialist, helping others struggling with addiction, drawing on her own experiences to offer guidance, encouragement, and hope. She moved into a small but cozy apartment, creating a safe and welcoming space for Hope's visits. The relationship between James and Sarah evolved into a respectful and cooperative co-parenting partnership. They learned to communicate effectively, to put Hope's needs first, and to support each other in their respective roles in her life. They were not a couple. They were not even close friends, but they were united by their shared love for Hope and their commitment to providing her with a stable and nurturing environment. James, once a solitary figure, found himself surrounded by a new kind of family, a family forged not by blood alone, but by circumstance, by choice, and by the enduring power of forgiveness and compassion. He had discovered the true meaning of wealth, not in the accumulation of material possessions, but in the richness of human connection, the joy of fatherhood, and the satisfaction of making a positive difference in the lives of others. He never told anyone about Hope's past. Hope is his daughter in his heart. Hope, while thriving in her new life, never forgot her early childhood, the memory of her mother's struggles, and the alleyway where she had been found. She developed a deep empathy for those less fortunate, a desire to help others, a commitment to social justice. She excelled in school, showing a particular aptitude for science and mathematics. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, of using her knowledge and skills to heal others, to alleviate suffering, to make the world a better place. The tattoo on her arm, once a mystery, a symbol of abandonment, became a reminder of her resilience, her strength, and the unexpected circumstances that had brought her to this new life, this new family, this new future. Hope's light, the light of a child rescued from the darkness, illuminated the lives of those around her, transforming their grief, their loneliness, and their struggles into a tapestry of hope, healing, and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and to find love and connection in the most unexpected of places. The millionaire who had found a baby in a dumpster had not only saved a life, but he had also rediscovered his own, finding purpose, meaning, in a family he had never dreamed of, all thanks to a tiny, tattooed arm and the enduring power of a second chance.